Nice to see all of you. Welcome to Translating the Spirit, the Embrace of the Invisible. The four of us have agreed to keep the introductions brief so as to have more time for substantive conversation. Suffice it to say that Anne Carolyn Klein teaches in the Department of Religion at Rice University and co-founded Dawn Mountain, a center for serious study and practice of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition generally and of the Nyingma tradition in particular. And she is the author of 7 books thus far, including Meeting the Great Bliss Queen, Buddhists, Feminists, and the Art of the Self, and other wonderful books, which I encourage you to read. David Germano teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, where he has over many years and with tremendous exertion built the online Tibetan and Himalayan library, an extraordinarily rich resource for all sorts of knowledge about Tibetan and Himalayan cultures. And our very honored guest, Dzigar Rinpoché, has, among many other things, founded and directed the Mangala Shri Bhuti group of centers for Buddhist study and practice. More important for our present purposes, of course, are the many years that they have given to Tibetan Buddhist literary and contemplative tradition, each in their own way. And at the risk of embarrassing them and incurring their wrath, I will say that it would be difficult indeed to find other people who have devoted themselves so fearlessly and creatively and genuinely to the subtle and intricate depths and breadth of Buddhist literature and Buddhist contemplative practice. I've made some questions for our guests, and we'll start with the first one and see where things go. So with that, let's get to it. As we know, in the Tibetan library, we have an enormous literature, and in the realm of contemplative practice, we have a rich and vast field. The relationship between them seems complex, and it is laden with implications for transmission and translation. David, if I may ask you to begin, what do you make of this?
Yeah, oops. Thanks, Jules, for the introduction. So I've been thinking about this for pretty much my whole adult life, but not exactly been asked to talk about it. So for the last 48 hours since coming here and hearing more about the Jaipur Literary Festival and hearing all the different authors talk and so forth, it's given me cause for new reflections. And the larger context is, on the one hand, what's the relationship between these two? We have a huge body of Buddhist literature of all sorts. I mean, fiction, narrative, cosmological, biographical, memoirs, autobiographical, ritual, contemplative, etc. And then you have this huge swelter of contemplative practices of all types. I mean, empathy cultivation, dramatic performative visualizations, complex somatic kinds of things happening and so forth. And what's the relationship between the two? And the other 2 questions I have that relate to this is, what's the role of aesthetics in meditation? Because we've talked a lot about that in terms of literature, but what about meditation? In the same way, what about creativity or imagination in meditation? And I think the larger kinds of questions I have is which has come up in every talk I've heard here, which is the relationship of literature to a complex set of practices that mark our lives. And I think that one of the things that is pretty obvious insight, but I've been thinking about it a lot the last couple of days, is the degree to which literature has become so specialized, so professionalized, so removed from other quarters of our life, which is a syndrome that really marks modernity in many different domains. It's not just literature. But when I think about my experience, looking back at classical Tibetan Buddhist literature and also how it is lived in today's world in different parts of Tibet, where I've spent a large part of my adult life, that's not how things happen there. They're kind of deeply connected with each other, and we can't easily split these things apart. And so just a few different insights to throw out there. One is that the different literary genres are not apart. you'll be in a single text and there'll be a narrative section, then there'll be a philosophical section, then a poetic section, then there's a whole thing about contemplative practices, or you find these texts in big, huge anthologies where they're all mixed together. And you also can't separate. You can't say like, oh, that's the narrative part, that's the philosophical part, that's the contemplative part, that's the poetic part. Just when you thought you'd nicely compartmentalize them, it doesn't work out at all. And suddenly the meditative turns out to have nothing to do with meditation whatsoever. I mean, really, probably no one ever practiced that in the history of Tibetan Buddhism. It turns out to be about something else. Or there's a narrative you're reading along thinking, that's pretty weird, and then all of a sudden the narrative turns out, you realize, oh, that's all about some meditative experiences in a very interesting kind of way. So the way these things are constantly spilling kind of back and forth. And so maybe I'll just wind up my initial thoughts by saying, I've been thinking for the past couple of days about two directions. On the one hand, let's look at literature and think of it as a contemplative practice. What would it look like if we pursued literature as a contemplative practice, the way we see this in Buddhist literature? And I've been thinking the last actually couple of months about creating a course on the Dueno elegies that's actually a meditative program, and how I would pursue that venture, and how I would teach my students at the University of Virginia to read the elegies as part of a formal practice, drawing upon the principles of how contemplation happens in Tibet, a beginning, a middle, and an end, setting an intention, drawing attention to the type of awareness that you're bringing to the activity that you're engaged in, considering how to integrate those experiences into your life in the conclusion, and so forth. And on the other hand, something I think that often the way we think about meditation could benefit from would be to look at it from the kinds of perspectives that are ubiquitous in this festival. Issues of how we approach literature, whether it's nonfiction or fiction or poetry and so forth, thinking about it as highly imaginary or highly imaginative in character, governed by creativity, people bringing a kind of participatory engagement where you read one sentence and you project a world, then you read the next sentence and you revise your world, and how meditation would look like if we looked at it from the ways we look at these acts of creative literature, and to see where those two directions might take us, because I think they would really potentially help us reconsider how these boundaries we've created around literature and meditation respectively could be dismantled to our greater good.
Thank you, David. Annie?
Thank you for that amazingly rich display of issues and themes that we have been talking about and thinking about. Especially what strikes me is the multiplicity of genres in Tibetan and other contemplative literature, and also the multiplicity of genres of meditation itself that David alluded to. And so for me, it raises the question of, well, what exactly is a word? And what do words have to do with the kinds of wordless experiences toward which at least some meditative practices are oriented? And there's something that one of the great writers of the Tibetan tradition, Jigme Lingpa, 18th century, says. He says, the essence of speech is wind, is energy, is current, is a flow. So that's not a dictionary, something that you find in a dictionary. That is to say, you don't find flowing in a dictionary. That's something that's in the body. So it seems to me that part of the boundaries that we are lighting, and I think that the dissolving of boundaries that David mentioned between literature and contemplation is also there in many ways in the contemplative enterprise, between self and other, between outer and inner, between the kinds of words that are written in a text and that we read, and the way we assimilate those words when we digest them. The Book of Common Prayer says words are to be read, learned, and deeply digested. And this is very much part of the contemplative's relationship to words. And thus, it seems if we take this point about the currents, winds, energies that are in the body, that are outside of the body, that thinking about this and listening to all of the amazing speakers that are here today, it bubbled up for me that what Jigme Lingpa perhaps is saying is that the words really have to be, it's his way of saying that these words have to be deeply digested, deeply internalized, become part of us, become part of our being. And this falls rather well into many tropes of Asian culture, and particularly Buddhist culture in Tibet, where we understand every consciousness, every mind. So who's the reader of these words? Well, your pinky doesn't read a word. Your nose doesn't. We would probably mostly say that your mind is reading, but mind, where is mind? It affects all of our senses and all of our experience. So there's a way of connecting with the word that is also shifting something in us, because in this view, every consciousness, it is commonly said, rides a steed of wind. That's a way of expressing that mind is like being on a rider, that the thoughts that we have, the emotions that we have, the processes that we go through when we do contemplative practice, a formal session of contemplative practice, or invite a contemplative space to be with us through all our activities, that this is really an embodied experience. And so part of the translation that is occurring, I think, in the contemplative way of relating with literature is that the energies that are the essence of certain words that can be felt in the body are deeply ingested and deeply become part of us and really shift how one lives in the world. So that kind of reading, or even a simple practice, so-called simple but not easy practice of placing attention on a chosen object. It strikes me that that is very clearly a reorganization of our own energies. We're not going like this, maybe that's how we're used to living, but now we're going living in our body a little differently, changing our relationship to ourselves also. So fundamentally, I think one thing that reading, deep reading, and contemplative practice have in common is there is the opportunity to use our imagination, our intention, our embodied experience to actually change our relationship to ourselves. And when we change our relationship to ourselves, we have a possibility of changing our relationship to others. And this is a very kind of challenging enterprise, a profoundly challenging enterprise, and we definitely need words to help us along the way, and there's also a time to allow words to go away. On the path, we are perhaps most essentially a wave trying to really recognize our connection with the ocean, and we need words. And we also need to let go of words, because swimming, ultimately, if the path is a movement from seeing to being, which is one way of expressing a whole series of moves, then there's a time that words will have done their work, and we ride on what they have left us with.
Thank you very much. I did something.
Well, I want to, first of all, acknowledge Anne and David and thank them for all their years of work to preserving the Tibetan literature, as well as also really working very hard to promote the Tibetan literature and teaching the Tibetan literature in colleges, as well as also in their fields. Tibetan literature, and as well as the Tibetan culture in large, is a little bit in, as we know, vulnerable right now, and it's in danger. So someone really outside of the Tibetan community who really has made a connection to the Tibetan literature, as they have done, and as well as also to really dedicate all their life, is a really remarkable thing for us Tibetan, as well as also for someone who cares for the Tibetan literature. It is a remarkable endeavor, and we all must feel tremendously grateful, and I do feel tremendously grateful, and I want to thank both of them for their work. And now the question here that you have asked, can you repeat the question?
Yes, Rinpoche. In simplest form, it says, on the one hand, we have a great many books of all sorts, as David was saying. And then along with that, there are these rich traditions of meditation.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out what exactly the relationship is between the two of them. You know, there's many ways to think about it. We all know, if we've studied it all, we've heard about Toba Samba Gomba, hearing, contemplating, meditating. You have to hear the teaching from someone, then you have to think about it, and then you have to meditate upon what it means. So there's that, but there's other ways of coming at it too, you know. And that's not the only relationship. Meditation, as we see, becomes a kind of creative enterprise on its own, and it's not easy to box it in, you know, as to how one goes with this, especially in a tradition that you represent, Rinpoche, with the continual revelations from some other world altogether as it is. So I just wondered if you'd care to reflect on some of that.
Yeah, I think in Tibetan literature, we have in the Dharma, we have a Kanjur and Tenjur, the oral words of the Buddha himself, and then all the commentaries that the great noble land of India, scholars and the snow mountains of Tibet scholars have written. So in that, as far as sort of approaching the Kanjur and the Tenjur as in a general knowledge, one can actually approach the Kanjur and Tenjur as a general knowledge and to expand one's mind. And there is so much that one can actually be benefited by reading the Kanjur and Tenjur. Just reading one text, something like Bimala Kirti Sutra, and as well as also reading, for example, Tenchu, like a Bodhisattva Avatara, or Tibetan text, something like 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva, one can benefit tremendously so. But in large, what you actually comprehend in reading the Kanjur and Tenjur is really the kind of a great, the minds of the Buddha onwards, all of the great scholars of noble land of India and Tibet. And you are really coming to having some glimpses of the enlightened mind and their sort of like a great knowledge. But then as far as bringing all of that into your own personal path, then you need a personal path. Personal path here then, if you are to enter in the Tibetan tradition, whether it is from the kind of any of the Vajrayana tradition that came to Tibet from the noble land of India, the 8 different Vajrayana traditions that came from India to Tibet, you know, you need to receive the initiations, you need to receive the transmissions, and then you need to follow the instructions that is specifically designed and designated to bring you from the ground level to the path level, from the path level to the fruition level of that, that particular path that you have made in a connection from your previous lives, so-called merit, and as well as in this life, what you have found to make a connection with your own sort of like interest. And then there, you know, you have the journey. You have the journey, and the journey is lifelong. And whether I think that journey that is lifelong is going to be understood by others or world at large. Personally, that is a journey of an enlightenment for you. And in the Vajrayana path, particularly, that is very all-pervasive in Tibet, promises one to attain a state of enlightenment, unlike in the Mahayana, unlike in the Hinayana, in one lifetime, especially in the Anuttara Yoga. And we take that very seriously. And it's not hypothesis. So in that way, then there's a sort of really, you could make the connection to the Buddhist literature of the Kanju and the Tenju as an expanding of your knowledge and understanding of the Dharma. Then also you have the personal path of the Vajrayana, and then in there you have the sort of perspective of attaining a realization and attaining a state of enlightenment within one lifetime. So it's a very alive. And so far, until this point, it has never really become a sort of arcade and out of date. And hopefully, we as in Tibetan, and now the Tibetan Buddhist lineages, Vajrayana lineages coming to the West, hopefully it will be preserved in Tibet, in Tibetan communities, as well as also outside of the Tibet and the Tibetan community in the Western world, in the Western communities who are following the Tibetan Buddhist teachings and path. So the chances of being preserved in that way, I think, increases rather than it decreases. Though, of course, we face some challenges with the modern time, as all faith and religions are challenged by the modern time and the kind of the schedules that the modern people have, and the time that the modern people have or not have to spend on their cushion, of course, is relevant here. But nonetheless, I think, overall, I think Tibetan Buddhism and the Vajrayana teachings and the lineages being all pervasively appreciated in the larger world, I feel very positively that it's going to be preserved for a long time to come.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Having listened to each other a little bit, I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to say further on this before we move on.
Yeah, you know, I've been listening to a number of talks, especially about modern Indian literature. Is this working? Yes. Yeah, okay. About modern Indian literature. And there is a modern Tibetan literature that's extremely vibrant. And so I've been thinking about that over the course of the week. And I think about some of my favorites. There's this tremendous poet from northeastern Tibet named Jangbu, who has written some extraordinary modern poetry. A contemporary novelist, Tsering Dundrup, who's written a number of novels, including one called Ancestor, that's this really fascinating exploration of kind of traditional Tibetan society and a process of change. And also a great modern Tibetan rock band based in Lhasa called Namchak, which I listen to all the time. And, you know, I love these guys, and I love the stuff that they produce, but it's very familiar. I mean, it's very Tibetan in character, but it's very familiar to someone who grew up in America and appreciates modern literature and modern music and modern poetry. And I think the thing I keep coming back to, that as much, I much prefer reading and listening to them than modern Buddhist writings. I'm just be totally honest. I mean, if I'm going to read Buddhist writings, I'll read the classical stuff, which I find much more interesting. And if I want to read modern Tibetan output, I listen to rock music and I read poetry and I read novels because they're more interesting to me. They're more creative and imaginative and more attuned to the changing nature of the Tibetan experience. But what's not there is practices, is a community of practices. It's disinvested from that. It's just like what we experience literature like in Europe or modern India or America and so forth. And that's the part that I just keep coming back to. What would literature look like today if we reinvested it in that old lost world, which is not characteristically Tibetan Buddhist? We also see it in Islam, we see it in medieval Christianity, we see it all over the world. It's a change we made 300 or 400 years ago and have been exploring the consequences, the intended and unintended consequences of that. So I really wonder, what would it look like? How could we reinvigorate Buddhist literature and meditation, but also reinvigorate our approaches to literature by focusing on this issue of practices and communities that are built out of common practices that literature weaves in and out of. So that's my obsessive idea for the weekend.
You know, I was thinking in relationship to what you said earlier and also what you said just now about the certain kind of dissolving of boundaries between, you know, us as modern persons and a relationship with Tibetan literature now, for example, as you're describing. And I'm also thinking that there is a kind of boundary that seems to me related to that, is the dissolving of a boundary between what is exotic and what is not exotic. In other words, words, mystics use words and everybody uses words all the time. Great yogis have currents running through their bodies in certain ways that we can't approximate, but we have that too. In other words, contemplative practice is, it seems to me, you know, it's a way of human beings expressing what seems to be at the depth of the heart of being human. And if we isolate off this like classical literature or the great masters as exotic or as embodying things and qualities that have nothing to do with us, then I think that's a loss. And in some ways, it may be, I don't listen yet to Tibetan rock and roll.
I'll give you the
okay. But, you know, it may be that what is happening in that case, or what tends to happen in culture anyway, is that we lose sight of these deeper meanings, and then we're feeling starved and empty, and we're bringing them back. And that may be part of, you know, the Western world lost its enchanted quality a couple centuries ago, and maybe part of the Western interest in meditation and so on right now is because we had it and we want to bring it back. And there's, I think it's not, the trajectory of a word into one's being is not all that exotic, really. It's why we respond the way we do to poetry. Or if I were to say, you know, the center of the earth is directly underneath you right now. And if you were curious in exploring that, you could think about that. Yeah, it's kind of true. And you could really sit with that and be with that. And that would be one example, a very simple example of using a word to change your, or at least explore your experience. But that takes time. And that relates to what Rinpoché was saying, this very important point about we don't have time, we don't think we have time. And one of the things that we had talked about as we were thinking about this panel is, you know, reading, people read when you feel like reading, but if you have a meditative commitment, you do it whether you feel like it or not, and you do it, you know, there's a dailiness, an ongoingness, a continuity that is difficult, as Rinpoché was saying, is difficult in our culture. And at the same time, one of the things that we are learning with the contemplative neuroscience, I was reading recently that they have determined that pretty much any kind of expertise, whether playing an instrument, becoming a poet, becoming a great writer, requires about 10,000 hours of practice, which is about 20 hours a week for 10 years. And from the neuroscientific point of view, they're saying, well, maybe that's how long it takes, you know, the brain and body, I would say body, to really assimilate. So a lot of respect to that kind of commitment to people who make it, you know, especially in the face of this kind of cultural, you know, we have a culture of distraction, not a culture of attention. So that is really a transformative moment to a transformative process that I think you were alluding to, and that I think characterizes a contemplative path.
Yes, it's true what David is saying. Tibetan literature is not only Nangdun Rigpa or the inner science, which is the Dharma. There is Da Nyinga, Dzigar, as well as also many other
poetry,
creative
theater, grammar, opera, things like that.
So in all of this, Tibetan culture is very rich, as I think many of you know. Now, in the modern time, there's the Western education, which is being a very sort of predominantly all-pervasive all over the world. And people really being forced to study them in schools, as well as also in the higher educations, in order to get a good job, in order to sort of like do well in the world. They are also forced to really adapt the learning of the Western education system well, and also to really not only learn, but then to sort of really make of that as a part of their life. So that makes a little bit of an difficult for students in the schools to focus as much as in the old days, how people were able to focus on the Tibetan poetry, for example, Tibetan theater, Tibetan music, or Tibetan Da is
study of grammar.
Grammar. Yeah. So now that's a sort of a fact, and the pressures of life the young kids in the schools or in the college, facts and the pressures of life meeting with the facts and pressures of life, in turn then sort of has this not so much time or even incentive or interest to kind of go deep into that. Yeah. Which is sad, and but hopefully as the Tibetan culture in exile, as well as also Tibetans in exile, as well as also Tibetan in Tibet, financially able to secure themselves and rise above the poverty and rise above challenges that they face in this big transition. Maybe perhaps there is going to be a reinvestment in sort of preserving those things, and then really sort of like getting deep into it, and then also enjoying one's own rich heritage, as well as also to be able to communicate to the outside world what they are, and then also to maybe perhaps who are interested to teach them. So in that sense, I think David is right. There's a lot of richness outside of the Dharma in the literature of Tibet. And that is not being generally known so much in the Western world, because the Western people are mostly interested in Dharma and not in the other things. But if somebody like David, who is familiar with the Tibetan heritage knows it, and I'm glad he mentioned it.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to mention something about, we had this session on oral knowledge yesterday, and I spend a lot of my time overseeing projects that try to document oral types of knowledge and tradition in Himalayas and Tibet, Bhutan, and so forth. And I've been thinking this weekend about the relationship between meditation and oral culture. And I don't mean like oral commentaries from teachers about how to meditate, but I mean the kind of oral knowledge and culture that was embedded in local villages. So for example, there would be songs like all over the world, but you would sing this lyric as you're pounding the rocks in the chain gangs in the Cultural Revolution. And as your hammer goes down, this lyric would be done, and the cadence would be like this. Or you'd be flirting with people, young people. I mean, the songs and the riddles and the histories and so forth, they were all bound with the rhythms of their life. They were like joints in articulating the world in which Tibetans live. And so I'm thinking about the contemplative practices and their relationship with that kind of oral literature, because in a similar way, they're again about practices, but the meditation is more about personal practices of self-development and so forth. But there's some kind of hidden continuity there that I think is raises questions for us to ponder.
Well, it reminds me of yesterday we heard this phrase, the secret life of words, you know, and that's been resonating for me ever since. As I kind of figured, even though I wrote out 4 questions, I didn't really expect we'd get through all 4. I guess I thought maybe we'd get to the second one, but apparently not. Because I think we should offer all of you an opportunity to ask some questions of our panelists. We have to stop fairly soon. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? No. Maybe the lady over here, please.
I first wanted to thank all of you for a very interesting, fascinating discussion. My question is for you, Rinpoché. How do you think the Chinese occupation of Tibet has influenced Tibetan, religious practices and culture, and the footprint of the religious practices?
Chinese occupation in Tibet, of course, as any occupation of a country that is not one's own is definitely has a conflict. Conflict in many fronts, socially, economically, and as well as also culturally and religiously, as well as also in what's happening in the present time and what's happening in the future, how it's all going to sort of like work out for the greater good of the nation of Tibet or citizens of Tibetan. All of this, hopefully, in near future, within the time frame of hopefully His Holiness Dalai Lama's lifespan, that we will sort of be able to really get to in a positive place. So far, it's been devastating. Thank you.
Do we want to chant that verse as a way to conclude?
Sure.
Well, yeah. I suspect we're, coming close to the very end here.
You have time for one more quick.
Well, we were going to maybe one question, a quick one, and then we wanted to close by chanting a verse.
Beautiful.
We could do both. Was it? Who had a question? Who was it?
Yeah. Here? No? Yes.
Oh God.
This question is directed for any and all of you capable of answering it. Basically, do you think that the movement of Tibetan culture into the modern era has created a lack of authenticity or the opposite of that?
I think it depends on who you're asking. I mean, if you're asking about Tibet and Tibetans, that would be one question. And if you're asking about people here in Boulder, Colorado, for example, that would be another question. And I think for Tibetans that right now what happened is a very familiar story, a forced violent encounter with modernity as an alien other, a Chinese alien other. And the response to that has been very creative on the one end, and I think in religious circles it's been fairly conservative. Not a tremendous amount of innovation, but rather battening down the hatches and trying to preserve something that suddenly looks very, very fragile. But I think when we look at it coming into Boulder, Colorado, here we are, a bastion of Tibetan Buddhism in North America, and thinking about America overall, you know, to me, we should embrace the creativity of that process. And on the one hand, I personally love old traditional classical Buddhist culture, but I'm also deeply involved at the University of Virginia in thinking about how to extend these principles into business, architecture, healthcare training, K-12 education, and so forth. And I think when people asked me a few years ago when I got very involved with K-12 education, my Buddhist studies friends, what are you doing? You're wasting your life, you know? And I said, if you think there's anything less profound than what happens in a first grade classroom, good luck with your life.
Thank you. Do we have 1 minute?
Yes.
Will, could you put that up for us? We thought, I mean, we were going to go talk about this some, and what I'd written one sentence just to introduce it, and it went, all these words, and yet something eludes them. This is a very famous verse that any practitioner of Tibetan Buddhist tradition knows. So we thought we might chant the Tibetan together, and then we could all chant the English together. It'll be up there if you like. We'll have to make up a melody as we go, but it should be fun. So I think I promised to start it, so we'll just go. Masam jume shira paruchin magye minga namge ngowani soso ranri yishi juyuwa tusum gyawe yumla chatse lo. If you could slide that up a little bit, Will, so they can see the English. There you go. Wisdom cannot be said, thought, or expressed, unborn, unceasing essence of space. Feel the precise wisdom and presence. Buddha's yum through all time bows to you. And we were playing with the first line. Can you scroll up just a little bit? So, we thought particularly appropriate for here and just as well. Wisdom beyond words, thought, or story about this question of literature and meditation, or even inexpressible through speech or thought, knowledge at its very best gone to the further shore. They're just different ways of saying that first line. Anyway, thank you all. We feel like we just barely scratched the surface on something that we really never talk about in any kind of setting like this. This has been an extraordinary occasion for us to have a chance to explore something quite new.
And I would like to add to that, all of you, thank you very much for coming and being a good supporter of Tibetan culture and the Tibetan movements. I know you many, and you have been, and please continue for the support of Tibet and for the support of Tibetan cause. Thank you very much.
And that has its own kind of authenticity. Back to you.
Thank you all very much.